Hey everybody, my name is Dr. Scott Giacomucci, and I'm the author of Trauma-Informed Principles in Group Therapy, Psychodrama, and Organizations, Action Methods for Leadership. And in this video today, I wanted to talk to you a bit about the content from Chapter 9 in this book, which is focused on the fifth of the 6 trauma-informed principles outlined by SAMHSA. This chapter is titled Empowerment, Voice, and Choice in Group Therapy, Psychodrama, and Leadership. So in this video, before we jump into this video, I want to just name that these 6 trauma-informed principles really go hand in hand. Although I'm going to be talking about this principle as separate from the others, it would be really important that you also consider the other 5 trauma-informed principles in your work. And I encourage you to check out some of the other videos on this channel that outline the other 5 trauma-informed principles. We can't fully embody the spirit of empowerment, voice, and choice without also addressing the other trauma-informed principles. So trauma, by its nature, is inherently disempowering for trauma survivors. The trauma can be characterized by unspeakable terror, helplessness, powerlessness, which are fundamentally disempowering. In most cases, the victim of trauma has their voice, their choice, and their power taken from them. So it makes sense that SAMHSA would really elevate this as a trauma-informed principle: voice, choice, and empowerment. A traumatic experience often disintegrates one's sense of personal power, mastery, control, confidence. Trauma, as well as traumatic stress, can really impact one's ability to speak up and feel like they have a voice in the aftermath of that trauma. I mean, so much of the work that we end up doing in trauma therapy and trauma recovery is about helping clients find their voice and use their voice. In the midst of trauma, a victim often cries out for help, but might feel a sense of abandonment or voicelessness when nobody responds, or the people or systems that were supposed to be there to protect them, to prevent this type of thing from happening, abandon their authority and don't. There can be a real mistrust that develops in the aftermath of trauma, a distrust that nobody's going to listen, nobody's going to respond next time I ask for help because they didn't respond when I really needed them. There can be this sense of learned voicelessness or learned helplessness that develops in the aftermath of trauma. Learned voicelessness, although it can sound like it's about the trauma survivor's lack of ability to speak up, but it's less about their ability to speak up and more about their lack of confidence in people or systems to respond when they do speak up. And this sort of voicelessness even has some neurobiological grounding, in that in neuroscience studies related to trauma, when they ask someone to remember a traumatic experience and they take a brain scan at that moment and they look at parts of the brain that are active or that are less active or inactive, one of the parts of the brain that's entirely shut down is the Broca's area, which is the speech and language part of the brain. And so this finding has really challenged us as therapists, especially, to reconsider the effectiveness of talk therapy alone. If the speech and language part of the brain is shut down when somebody's remembering a traumatic experience, thinking about a traumatic experience, how helpful is just talking about it going to be? This finding also really validates what every trauma survivor knows, is that it's really hard to find words to talk about the trauma. We don't want to talk about it. It's painful to talk about it. It's hard to talk about it. And it's really difficult to convey the experience of it because it's so overwhelming. Trauma's devastating impact on one's sense of empowerment, choice, and voice make each of these principles essential to a trauma-informed approach. A trauma survivor's power, their voice, and their choice are so often diminished. Therefore, our approaches must orient around restoring power or empowering, emphasizing their voice and their choices. In the context of power and empowerment, we should differentiate between personal power and an abuse of power. Sometimes trauma survivors can kind of flip-flop back and forth between powerlessness or reenacting unhealthy power dynamics in relationships. Empowerment is really about a restoration of neutrality, voice, and choice. It's about power with and power to and power within, rather than having power over others. And there's a lot that's been written about those differentiations. I want to challenge us to reflect on how are we elevating the voices of our clients and avoiding reenactments of abandonment? In what specific ways do we promote choice and autonomy in our work with trauma survivors? In my work, it's one of the first things that I do is I emphasize the client's right to choose how much they want to participate, what they want to share and when, how much they want to share, in what way they want to share or talk about their trauma in terms of specifics or in a general way. In my groups, all the clients know they have the option to participate, to observe. They have a choice about everything. That forcing somebody to do trauma therapy or forcing somebody to talk about trauma before they're ready to is really not helpful, and it's potentially harmful. So I want to talk more about this fifth trauma-informed principle of empowerment, voice, and choice as it relates to group therapy and group work specifically. So group work is unique as an intervention in its effectiveness and its capacity for empowerment, voice, and choice. The mutual aid process and the peer support within the group initiates a collective sense of empowerment for the entire group. The group that taps into its collective power initiates a parallel process of each individual accessing and harnessing their own internal power and their own sense of empowerment. So the power of the group is really, really potent in cohesive and safe groups. Part of this empowerment process helps individuals reconnect to a sense of autonomy, a sense of choice, and a sense of ownership within their own lives. Many times in the group process and the trauma recovery process, the fundamental skill of boundary setting and making choices becomes really central and really a key component of learning and practicing within the group process. This trauma-informed principle of choice promotes a reconnection to autonomy for the trauma survivor, who often might feel like they've lost their sense of autonomy or control over their life because of what they've gone through. Group therapy and group work provides a variety of opportunities for voice, for choice, and for empowerment. And there's something unique about the experience of giving voice to your wants, your needs, your feelings in a group setting compared to an individual setting. There's a increased power to it in a group in terms of being witnessed, being heard, being seen in a social setting, especially if we've started to lose our sense of trust that others are going to hear us when we talk, are going to take us seriously, are going to even believe us when we tell them about our experiences. So there seems to be something specifically unique about group work and its advantages over individual work when it comes to this trauma-informed principle of voice and empowerment. So I want to challenge you for a moment to reflect on your own experiences of being in groups, of being in classrooms or communities that felt empowering. What was it specifically about those experiences in group settings that made it feel empowering? What were the factors that led to the sense of empowerment? What were those factors on an individual level and on a collective level? And how can we actively work to cultivate those factors in our own groups? So this trauma-informed principle of voice, choice, and empowerment is also particularly important for organizations and for trauma-informed leaders and leadership. Organizational leadership, like group leadership, is enhanced through a process of centralizing empowerment, voice, and choice. Remember, an organization is really just a group of people that come together. So all of those group dynamics and group leadership skills that we learn as group therapists and group workers are also really relevant in organizational settings. I feel like for my own journey of becoming an organizational leader, was really enhanced by my experience training in group work and group dynamics and sociometry and psychodrama. So, as trauma informed leaders, part of our job, our role inherently, is to empower others to access their own leadership within themselves. And this comes back to that differentiation I talked about earlier in terms of the difference between power over, power with, and power within. That we want to be cultivating power with and power within rather than abusing our power and using it over others. In the research, there was a meta analysis that shows that psychological empowerment is positively related to employee outcomes, job satisfaction, commitment to the organization, and job performance. And empowerment is negatively related to staff strain and stress and staff turnover. So there's lots of good reasons to focus on voice, choice, and empowerment within our organizations. Leaders can promote empowerment, voice, and choice through collaboration with staff, through providing professional development opportunities. Involving staff in the decision making is one of the simplest and most powerful ways we can do this. Giving staff as much autonomy as we can in defining or redefining their role when possible. Providing access to organizational information, giving staff ownership in the organization and its initiative, really empowering them to feel co-responsible for the organization, and employing self-led teams so that there's a sense of collaboration that's cultivated. Also really helps to utilize democratic decision-making processes that as leaders, instead of just making decisions on our own that are going to impact others, that we democratically make decisions. We check in, we get feedback, we ask people what they think, what they feel about certain proposed policy changes. We ask them if they have better ideas. I know in my own organization, the overwhelming majority of good ideas and structures and policies we've implemented were certainly not things that I thought about by myself. Most of the time, they were suggestions from staff members, from graduate students and interns that we hosted, or from clients. There's a lot of rich information, feedback, and wisdom available to us as leaders if we ask for it. And we can really make our organizations significantly better if we're frequently asking for feedback and reading the feedback and implementing changes based on that feedback. So inviting feedback from staff, creating changes in policy and programs and practices based on it is one of the simplest and most effective ways to empower staff and to really show them that we value their voice. As leaders, we have to keep in mind that a large portion of our staff are going to be trauma survivors. If you're working with humans or you're employing humans in your organization, a large majority of them are going to be folks who have experienced trauma. So centralizing these trauma-informed principles within our organizations, in particular, voice, choice, and empowerment, will help our staff be the best that they can be, empower them to be the best version of themselves. So the organization and the leadership really needs to cultivate a core belief in the resilience, in the strength, and in the capacity of both the clients that are served, but also the staff that are employed in the organization. Leaders and staff have to be approached as facilitators of recovery rather than as controllers of recovery. So this comes back to that previous trauma-informed principle about collaboration as well. So I want to challenge you to consider, in spaces where you do have some power, how can you practice power with the people you're working with rather than power over others? How can you practice collaboration and empowerment? It might be helpful to also consider the examples of leadership from the past, of empowering leadership from the past that you've encountered. Who are people in your life that have empowered you? Leaders that you've engaged with that have helped you become the best that you can be? And what are the things that they did specifically that help you feel empowered? Perhaps we can learn from our role models in this regard. Also, I want to challenge us to reflect on how are we eliciting and incorporating feedback from clients, community members, coworkers, and staff in order to refine our work, our programs, and our organization as a whole. Do we have a formal and structured process for getting feedback? Do we do exit interviews when people leave? Do we give client satisfaction surveys at, at discharge or at different intervals? Are we asking for feedback from staff? What are the ways in which your workplace is empowering or disempowering? And what are the ways that you can cultivate or advocate or collaborate to create change within your organization? So, next, in thinking about this fifth trauma informed principle, voice, choice, and empowerment, I want to reflect on how we can embody this specifically in psychodrama practice. So, psychodrama is unique as an approach in that it really empowers participants to reclaim control of their life through role playing, and the surplus reality of the process is inherently empowering in that it makes the impossible possible. Through psychodrama and role playing, we enter into a different dimension where we can experience anything, even things that are impossible in real life. And this can be really empowering for clients and even for trainees in training. I know for myself, in my own experience doing psychodrama as a participant and as a trainee, there were a number of psychodramas I participated in as the protagonist where there was something I was craving to experience either for my own healing or my own exploration or my own growth that would have been impossible or unlikely in real life. But through the surplus reality of psychodrama, it all becomes possible. And I can have an embodied experience of the thing that I crave to experience, or a dream or a vision that I have, which is quite empowering. Psychodrama philosophy has this belief in what we call the autonomous healing center within. And this comes from Zerka and Jacob Moreno, the founders of psychodrama. They argue that the primary purpose of our methods and the primary purpose of the psychodramatist is to help the protagonist and the group to tap into the autonomous healing center within their self, and that this is deep within the self, usually untouched by words. And we're simply guides helping the client remove barriers to accessing self-healing, to accessing all the good adaptive information and knowledge and wisdom and strengths and resources that already exist within them. So psychodrama philosophy is inherently empowering in this way. There's a classical psychodrama motto that says, follow the protagonist, which is really promoting empowerment in psychodrama, in that we're approaching the protagonist as the expert in their experience and as the center of the group, representing the group. And the psychodrama becomes focused on them rather than on the facilitator's perception of what's going on. So this is inherently empowering. I've also suggested that the motto of follow the protagonist might be inherently limiting at times when we're doing trauma-focused psychodrama, and that it can get us into some trouble, especially if we have trauma survivors that we're working with who might struggle with containment or reenacting or re-experiencing trauma and diving into the trauma too quick, too soon, than for what is safe for them and for the rest of the group. So as psychodramatists, we have a responsibility to also provide structure and containment for the process and to keep the psychodrama safe. So I've been borrowing some language from another approach, dynamic developmental psychotherapy, and offering a new psychodrama motto, follow, lead, follow the protagonist. That, of course, we need to follow the protagonist and enter their subjective reality, but we also have a responsibility to lead the protagonist, to provide structure and containment and boundaries and keep the process safe, while also following the protagonist in what's important and what's right for them. So this paradigm really centers the client and the group as the expert in their experience, while promoting empowerment, voice, and choice. But it also articulates the psychodrama director's responsibility to lead the process, that we're not completely passive, that we also have to be active in our leadership. Sociometry within psychodrama, or by itself, is also inherently empowering and exploring voice and choice. Sociometry is really a democratic process that elevates individual choices within the group in a collective way and elevates the individual voices within the group in a collective way. So using sociometry is a really direct and streamlined way to promote individual and group empowerment. Psychodrama elevates the voice of the group and the protagonist in each phase of the group process. In the warm-up, which is usually where we're using sociometry, in the action, if it's a psychodrama group, in the action we're doing psychodrama, and in the sharing process of the group, where each person gets the opportunity to speak up and to share how they were impacted by the psychodrama now that it's over. There's other interventions within psychodrama that really help cultivate voice, choice, and empowerment, one of which is doubling. So doubling is when we come and stand next to the protagonist and we offer a statement, something that we feel like is unspoken for the protagonist, something that would deepen the experience or label something meaningful that's going on for them. And the protagonist has the option to repeat what was said in their own words or to change it to something that is true for them. So doubling is especially empowering in that it's really promoting and role training a sense of voice, helping people use their voice to label what their experience is. Role training is another intervention that we can use, which helps with empowerment, voice, and choice. Now, role training would be where we're using some sort of future projection scene, something that we expect, a scene we expect to find ourselves in the future, or expect the clients to find themselves in the future. And we give them the opportunity to rehearse and to practice, to train in the role, so that when they go out into their lives and are faced with this situation, they already have some practice experientially responding. So this is role training, which can be particularly empowering. In client groups, this might look like practicing boundary setting with family members, and we might rehearse and practice setting boundaries with family members. In a professional setting or training groups, I often will use role training also around boundary setting. I find as professionals, we often need just as much practice with boundary setting as our clients, but also around having difficult conversations with clients, managing conflict with clients or colleagues, or asking for a raise to our supervisor, or negotiating a contract with an organizational leader. So lots of different ways that role training can be used for empowerment in client groups and in training groups or organizational settings. I find while I'm directing a psychodrama, that it's particularly helpful to remind the protagonist that they have control over this process, that if there's anything that doesn't fit for them, they can just let me know and we can change things up. If it feels like we're going too fast or too slow or a different direction than they want to go, I tell them to let me know. You have full control over this process. We're going to co-direct this psychodrama together. And then I like to remind the group about their choice to participate or not, that even if they get invited to play a role, they can respectfully decline the role if they really just want to observe. And then throughout the actual psychodrama, I like to give the protagonist as many choices as possible. Instead of being an authoritarian director and telling them this is what we're doing next, and then we're doing this, and now we're going to do this, I like to offer them options within a structure. I might say, first we need to bring some strengths and support to help us. So I'm being directive in that way. But then I'll say, which strength could help you? Which strength would you need? Pick a strength that you feel like you really need to accomplish our goal today. Or when we get to the climax of a psychodrama, right before it, I might offer multiple options for how we could interface with the issue, the trauma, and work towards the contract and the goal. Here's one option. We could have a conversation with the person who hurt you. If that feels like it's too much, another option is we could have a conversation with the part of you that was hurt, your inner child or yourself as a child, perhaps. If that doesn't feel right for you, we could have a conversation with you in the future, having healed from this trauma. We could have a conversation with your higher power, with God. We could have a conversation with the negative voices within your head that resulted from this trauma. We could have a conversation with shame that you said you've been struggling with because of the trauma. I'd like to offer multiple options, especially when we get to an antagonist role or a trauma-based role or a more intense and difficult role, to give the protagonist some choice. I find that there's multiple different ways of reaching the same contract, the same goal in a psychodrama, and that if we're creative enough to be able to see multiple options, we can offer the protagonist multiple options, which is inherently empowering. Of course, we can offer multiple options and make a recommendation. I might say, here's 3 different options that we could engage in next. The one that I think would be most helpful is this particular one. But you tell me which one feels like it would be most helpful for you. So rather than being authoritarian in our directing, it really helps to be checking in, be getting permission and consent throughout the process, asking how the protagonist is doing, and offering choices. So again, this is the 5th of the 6 trauma-informed principles: voice, choice, and empowerment. And like I mentioned earlier, we can't fully embody voice, choice, and empowerment in our organizations, in our groups, and in psychodrama if we're not also embodying the other 5 trauma-informed principles. So I really encourage you to take some time and reflect not only on this trauma-informed principle, but also on the other 5 trauma-informed principles. They really go hand in hand. If you wanted to learn more about those, I encourage you to check out the other videos on this channel. If you'd like to be notified when future videos are published on the channel, you could subscribe to our channel. If you found this helpful, it would really help if you liked the video, shared it with your friends or colleagues, and leave a comment in the chat. Tell us what was helpful about this video. What are the ways that you empower the folks that you're working with, clients or colleagues or staff members? How are the ways that you centralize voice and choice in your work as a trauma-informed professional and leader?